Hello everyone, this is Jotto, bringing you the HearthStone Weekly, bringing you the top decks, bringing you the top cards, and the state of the metagame for this week's tournament. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The top 8 of Managrind's tournament we had: first place, Spaj, Shaman Midrange, keeping his sort of title as one of the best Managrind players and one of the best Hearthstone players. Second place, Hearthstone Power, Rogue Spell Power Midrange. Third place, Winter, Hunter Pirates. Weird deck, I'll go over that a bit later. Fourth, Rorix, Warlock Aggro. Another weird deck. Fifth, me, Rogue Spell Power Aggro. Sixth, Mand, Rogue Spell Power Midrange. Seventh, Ezra Bar, Warlock Midrange. And eighth, Holy Snova, playing a Paladin Divine Shield deck. So, Spaj, we've seen this deck a lot. Like a lot. He's done incredibly well with this kind of mid-range deck. And just keep in mind, for all of these deck lists, they're not entirely optimized because the people playing them simply haven't had access to all the cards. So chances are there'll be improvements you can make to these decks. However, based on a limited card pool, that's why these decks have some weird things in them. Like in this case, one-ofs on a lot of things. Now, the interesting one about this deck is that we've seen the core before: Ascension Shieldmaster, Violet Teacher, Azure Drakes, Fire Elementals, Argent Commanders. But there's no Sunwalkers in here, which was interesting. There are, in fact, no Sunwalkers in here. There's Earthring Farseers, Lava Burst, Chillwind Yeti. There's a lot of sort of splash. It's not entirely focused, but obviously it did quite well. I think this version of Shaman Midrange focuses less on being focused on one goal and more on spreading out to try and compensate for its weaknesses. And it's an archetype which has proven to be tier 1 and very powerful. It's been incredibly underestimated over the past 2 weeks while beta's been out, and it's still one of the strongest archetypes, if not the strongest. So, Hearthstone Power's Rogue Spell Power Midrange. This deck confuses me. I don't really understand how this works. So basically, it's a Spell Power Rogue deck. Spell Power Rogue is, along with Shaman Midrange, in my mind, the strongest archetype. The weird thing about this one is it doesn't actually focus on early pressure or controlling. It does mid-range things like Twilight Drake and Ascension Shieldmaster and Ogre Magi and things like that, and it's a very odd deck. It's interesting. It is a very interesting deck. I don't know how consistent it is in the long run, but obviously it was consistent enough to get this far. And it managed to go through 8 rounds and actually win almost all of its rounds, apart from in the finals where it actually did take a game off the winning deck. So in this case, it's just as a Rogue Spell Power player, this deck confuses me a bit, but I recommend you try it out because this is something I'm definitely going to try out, because I just from looking at it, I can't figure out how it really works, but I'm sure if I played it enough, I would figure out how it worked as a deck, and that's something that intrigues me. But anyway, as the rundown, you got Azure Drakes, Dalaran Mages, Kobold Geomancers, Ogre Magi for the spell power. Twilight Drake and Ascension Shieldmasters hold down the mid game. SI7s and Perdition's Blade sort of function as double removal and pressure. And then Eviscerate, Fan of Knives to control the board with backstabs and assassinates, and just whittle them down with Sinister Strikes and burst damage from Eviscerates, because it can be a dual role, and your hero power, obviously. Interesting deck. I do want to try this one out. Third, Winter, Hunter Pirates. This is a deck I've never seen before. You've never seen this one before. That's a first in quite a while, actually. I've never seen a Hunter Pirates deck before. But anyway, this is a weird hybrid between Pirates and Hunter Control. It's basically all the traps thrown together with Eaglehorn Bow and Gladiator's Longbow for the pressure and board control. Then it plays a bunch of pirates because they interact with the weapons, because Eaglehorn Bow never leaves, and Gladiator's Longbow has high attack, so it compensates for a lot of things, like you get free Dread Corsairs and insanely powerful Bloodsail Raiders, and Captain Greenskin benefits massively from Eaglehorn Bow. It was a very interesting deck. Secret Keepers are something which I think works best in Paladin, just because the secrets cost 1. But Hunter definitely have some use for the card, because it's a 1-drop that becomes a 2/3 attacking on turn 2. And it's also protected by a trap. It's a very interesting 1-drop if you get it down on turn 1. But there aren't that many 1-drops in here, if any, actually. Apart from tracking, obviously. But you don't really want to play tracking on turn 1, because you want to see what you're looking for. So yeah, it's Secret Keeper, if it can, it always comes down turn 1, and it's a powerhouse unless they silence or remove it. And the ability to put that much pressure on with just a 1-drop is ridiculous. 4th, Rorik's Warlock Aggro. I have no idea how this got that far. I mean, I always thought Warlock Aggro was incredibly inconsistent, and so I never played it. I know a couple of people who did, and they just... It's a very powerful deck, but I just can't see it getting this far. Just because of how random the deck can be. It's an extremely powerful deck. If you get a good draw on this deck, you are flattening the other guy. Like, the demons are very powerful in short bursts. The problem with the demons, though, is that while they're very powerful straight up, their disadvantages, the longer the game goes, the more prevalent they are. And so you have to life tap every turn with this deck to compensate the discard effects. And if you're in a race, that's not always a good thing. But if you get a good draw, this deck will flatten people. It really does. It just pressures people down. But I would warn against sort of playing this in major tournaments, like not the weekly ones. Like, if you want to play this in the weekly ones, by all means, like, you'll have a blast playing this and probably flatten some people unexpectedly. But in major tournaments with like prize pools, I wouldn't recommend playing this, not because it's a weak deck, but because it's just so inconsistent. But obviously, if you get decent draws enough, you can get quite far with a Warlock aggro deck. So basically, if you want to have a lot of fun with a Warlock deck and you don't feel like playing Control, go ahead and throw this together, see how you do. But basically, it runs Doomguards, Succubus, Felguard as the demons, and Flame Imps. It also runs Pint-Sized Summoner to so you can put out 2/2-drops on turn 2 if you put it out with coin. Acidic Swampoos because weapons mess this thing over. Soulfire is big burst damage. Hellfire, big burst damage. Shadow Bolt, standard removal. Leroy Jenkins, big burst damage. A lot of this is based around charge and burst damage, and it's a very interesting deck. Very fun. It is an extremely fun deck to play. Just not the most consistent one you can. Alright, this is my deck. Now, I've been playtesting this on stream, so if you want to, this is one of the few decks where I can say if you want to see this in action, you can actually go look at my stream. I'll link it in the description. But this is a rogue spell power aggro deck, which it's spell power aggro like Hearthstone Power's. It's spell power like Hearthstone Power's deck. However, instead of Twilight Drakes and things like that, it plays Defias Ringleaders and Acidic Swampooses and Bloodsail Raiders and Fairy Dragons and things like that. Just very powerful early game. If you get a good start with this deck, you can't be stopped. But late game, you've got the Azure Drakes, Gadgets, Predation's Blades, Spell Power, Head Cracks. The idea of this deck is put as much pressure on early as you can, and then finish out with spell-powered head cracks and eviscerates. It's quite a simple style of playing, but it does work quite well and is one of the more reliable aggro decks. The one problem with Rogue in general right now is that the coin, if you get the coin as a Rogue, you instantly win, and if you don't get the coin as a Rogue, you don't do that well, and it's not because you're dependent on the coin, but it's because your opponent has it. And the extra card in the coin is such a large advantage that rogues don't really have a way of counteracting it that much, unlike a lot of other classes. They're all about tempo. So if you go first instead of second, you just lose tempo and it throws you off. And that's the one problem with rogue decks right now. And that's why Shaman mid-range is a bit more consistent, because it's not as dependent on coin flips. But rogue in general is a very powerful class right now. I just feel like they need to fix the coin. Or, in my opinion, they need to remove the coin and replace it with something else. Because the coin is a broken mechanic right now that really shouldn't be in the game. And it's causing a bunch of issues. But anyway, so rogue spell power aggro. Very fast deck. Bit more consistent than other aggro decks, but that's just because it has a late game strategy. And I would recommend at least trying it out if you play rogue along with the mid-range decks and things like that. Just try them all out, see which one you like, and then play them. Another rogue deck, another spell power mid-range deck. Now, this one played Assassin's Blades and still played Ogre Magi's and Dalaran Mages, etc. But it also played Saps and Head Cracks and Sinister Strikes, just tempo. There's a lot of tempo in this deck. And for draw power, something which the second place deck didn't have is a Gadgetzan and a Sprint for draw power. It was an interesting deck. I think that this one is it should be slightly more consistent if you go first, but it's slightly weaker if you go second than the previous two rogue decks, because this can compensate for going first, because you've got a lot of control and Sen'jins and Assassin's Blade and things like that. But going second is not like an auto win for this deck, because you don't have a lot of the early game aggro or like Twilight Drakes or something. So this is more consistent overall, but you don't quite get the power plays that the other two rogue decks do. Ezrabar. There's always a Warlock control or mid-range deck. I feel like control is just not good right now, so people are playing mid-range. But this is a weird deck. This is a really odd deck. Now, in this case, it's got the standard Jiraxis, even though I hate that card. But it's got the standard Jiraxis and Twilight Drakes and Sen'jins and Dread Infernals and things like that. Standard stuff for mid-range. But there's not enough spells in it or win conditions to be control. The curve isn't... It's quite low, but it's not low enough to be aggro. And it's a bit confusing. It feels like it's a very unfocused deck, but it has an answer to everything. I think sometimes these decks do work. Sort of just mashed up different types of resources mashed into one big ball, and if you draw your answer, it does very well. The one problem with making a deck like this is it's very inconsistent. It's entirely based on draw, because you have so many one-offs. Like, if you look at the actual deck list, there's a lot of one-offs, and while it lets you splash text to deal with other decks, it makes you less consistent overall, and it's something which some players, like me, I hate having one-offs, because I love consistency. But a lot of players like having one-offs because it gives them sort of an answer to everything. Like, sometimes they just draw what they need, and it's the one copy in their deck, and it does well for them, and it's good, and they like it. And then other times it just does nothing. So basically, this is a example of a Warlock mid-range deck that's not entirely focused on one point, and it's designed to deal with a lot of different things as opposed to being focused on one singular goal. And that's an interesting approach for me to look at as a deck builder myself. 8th, Holy Snova, Paladin, Divine Shields. Now, back in Cockatrice, there was a deck called Divine Blessings. It was tier 1 deck for a while, actually, where you had Divine Shields, Blessing of Kings, Blessing of Might, Blessing of Wisdom. This is a basically just entirely Divine Shield. It doesn't even play the blessings. Now, the interesting thing about doing that is that while it's very difficult for you to pump through your stuff, it's you have to be a lot more grindy in this kind of deck to power through. A lot more grindy, because the only sort of thing you can buff up is your Blood Knight. And besides Tyrion and Hogger, like, if Tyrion and Hogger get hexed or removed without, or silenced, you're in a bit of trouble because you lose your sort of ability to push forward damage. Because a lot of this deck is about pushing forward damage through Divine Shield, which it does work in a lot of situations, and it can, and that's why it's in top 8. But I know that this deck has a fatal weakness to pinging effects, where it just dies to pinging effects. It's very bad against Mage because of two things. One, the hero power, and the other one is Cone of Cold. Because Cone of Cold will freeze all the Divine Shield minions and ping all of them. However, this is an incredibly powerful deck against heroes without the ability to ping. Like, it's very good against Warrior. If they don't play Whirlwind, they are screwed. They can't do anything if they don't play Whirlwind. It's very good against Priest, because they just can't get rid of the Divine Shields. It's okay versus Rogue. It has some weakness to the Hero Power, Dagger, and Shiv, and Fan of Knives. And against Paladin, it does some serious work. In the mirror matchup, this deck has a huge advantage just because Paladins don't really have a way of pinging off Divine Shields without Silverhand Recruits, and Silverhand Recruits are very easy to control. So this is the deck which is... It's the kind of deck which has extremely good matchups and extremely bad matchups. While it's kind of like the one-up syndrome again. This is something which, for me, consistency is king. But for a lot of people, it's less about consistency. It's for sort of, how do I deal with this particular strategy? So what this deck has is it has a severe weakness to pinging effects. So it has a lot of ways of dealing with those things that can put pinging effects out. Like Argent Squire can restore Divine Shields with Hand of Protection, Redemption brings things back, Eye for an Eye just stops them just ignoring your stuff and going for you, Sunwalker protects her own stuff, things like that, Knife Juggler even. Knife Juggler deals with the Paladin Silverhand Recruits, because every time you play something, it just triggers the Knife Juggler, and so all the Silverhand Recruits die. There's a lot of techs in this deck. Deck tech. There's a lot of techs in this deck which are designed to deal with its weaknesses, and that's sort of the hallmark of a well-designed deck. And something which you got to keep in mind when you're designing a deck is you look at it, you think, alright, I'm happy with this. What's wrong with it? Like, what does it lose to? And then you've got to tinker around. It makes your deck slightly weaker, but it gives you a higher win percentage because you're gonna come across those bad matchups every so often. You need to be able to at least not automatically lose to them. And that's what most of these decks have done. And Holy Nova's deck is a perfect example of this with the Knife Juggler as Argent. Like, the Argent Squires deal 1-drops, things like that. Argent Protector gives things back to Divine Shield. It's very oriented towards, it has a goal, but it's good at dealing with things that counter it. Top 5 neutral cards. Now, this hasn't changed much in the past month. No, 2 months. I'm getting incredibly sick of seeing Sen'jin Shieldmaster, Azure Drake, and Argent Commander on the top 5 every single week. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, I know that these cards are powerful, and they're arguably overpowered, and they're also some of the best neutral minions in the game, arguably top 5 general. But come on, guys! Seriously. Whatever, I'll go over them. Sen'jin Shieldmaster. I don't know about you guys, but I'm sick of this thing. Like, it's 4 out of 8 decks. Like, a lot of people thought that this was just like a thing. Oh my god, people are playing Taunt right now. It'll die off in 2 months. Yeah, no. It did not die off. Sen'jin Shieldmaster is still here. And is actually being played more now. It's incredibly powerful. It's so reliable, and it just stops all aggression, and it's so hard to remove for control. Like, Shadow Bolt doesn't kill it. None of the 3 mana removal kills it. Some of the 4 mana removal doesn't kill it. It stops all the charge minions. It's incredibly powerful. It's it's on the barrier where it's between powerful and overpowered at this point. They need to do something to this card. The problem is they can't like nerf it or buff it, because then it directly becomes worse than either Ironfur Grizzly or better than Fen Creeper. So they can't do much to this thing. They actually have to redesign it. It's in a sweet spot where it's literally the most powerful 4-drop in the game at this point. It's like Violet Teacher competed with it for a bit, but it's not even close now because less people are playing spells. So you just have a bunch of shield masters. They need to do something to this thing. Seriously, like, it's when you see a card dominating competitive play for 2 months, you need to do something about it. And this is what we've got currently. The other one, I'm going to go down, even though I love the card. I'm actually going to go down the list and talk about that one a bit later. It's not quite as bad, but it's still pretty bad. But anyway, Senjin, something needs to happen with this card. It's too powerful. It is too powerful right now. And it's too good, too consistent, and it's a pillar of the format. And when you have one card as the pillar of a format, you have an issue balance-wise. Azure Drake. Now, I just want to point out that there are 2 spell power minions on here. Azure Drake is one of the cases where it's played in the Shaman mid-range deck as well, because it's a very powerful mid-range minion. However, the other 3 copies of it are in Rogue spell power. So yeah, there's not much to read into this, apart from the fact that it's a super powerful spell power minion. Although the fact that it made it into a non-spell power deck, being the Shaman mid-range deck, shows the power of cantripping. That's drawing a card. A minion that cantrips and only loses... Alright, the reason why Azure Drake is so powerful. Okay. Novice Engineer loses 2 attack, effectively, for its effect. Loot Hoarder loses an attack and a health. Gnomish Inventor loses 2 attack and a health, basically, from Chillwind Yeti. Azure Drake, the standard is 5/5 for 5. This thing loses 1 attack, 1 health, and then gains a spell power. It's insanely powerful. It's very aggressively costed. Like, if they wanted to make this thing bad, and they wanted to make, or not bad, but good in Arena and not in Constructed, they would make it 6 mana. But at 5 mana, it's so good, just because it gives spell power, and your opponent has to remove it, and you didn't spend anything apart from mana because you drew a card. I'm not surprised to see this. It is one of my favorite spell power minions because it cantrips. I love cantrip effects. And it's going to be in a lot of decks, I think. And it's a very underestimated card outside of Rogue. It's a very underestimated card outside of Rogue. There was actually a time in the metagame at the beginning of Cockatrice where Azure Drake was one of the most powerful cards and was dominating the format. But it died down a bit when spell power wasn't being played as much. But now it's making a comeback. And it's not just because of spell power, but it also draws you a card. It's draw power on a spell power minion. Okay. Played in 4 decks as well. Dalaran Mage. Okay, this is not a top 5 neutral card. This is a top 5 rogue card. This was played in 3 decks, all of which are rogue spell power. Not much to read into this, apart from the fact that it's a spell power minion. But the stat total is a very interesting thing for this. It could be a 3/3 for 3, and that would be worse. Being 2/4, it's very difficult to remove for a 3-drop, and that's why it's good. Because unlike Cobalt Geomancer, which is used as a combo starter because it dies, Dalaran Mage doesn't always die. It sits on the field. And they actually have to invest to kill it. They can't just randomly pick it off. They actually have to invest resources to kill the stupid 3-drop. And that's why it's good. It's the same kind of thing as Jungle Panther, where Jungle Panther always trades with something because it has 4 attack, or they have to remove it because it has 4 attack. It's a threat. In this case, it has 4 health and 2 attack, but the +1 spell power is the threat, so they still have to remove it. But it takes so many resources to remove this thing on turn 4 or turn 3. Because you want to play your Senjin, you don't want to deal with the stupid Dalaran Mage. But then if you put down your Senjin, they put down another combo starter and then eviscerate it for 5. So you have to deal with this stupid thing, and that's why it's good. That's why it's here. This used to be Blood Mage Thanos. I think Blood Mage is stronger than this card, but Blood Mage Thanos is not in everyone's deck right now, partly because no one has the legendary. Argent Commander, the other card I need to talk about here. Basically, Argent Commander has never been as overwhelming as Sen'jin. In limited tournaments, which was no epics, no legendaries, it was literally the most played card after Sen'jin, because it just, oh, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's a fire elemental that does 4, but sacrifices stats for it. It's a neutral fire elemental. There's not much, you can't really go wrong with a neutral fire elemental. But Argent Commander is very powerful. One of the most powerful 6-drops in the game. Top 5 minions in the game, in my opinion. Neutral ones at least. There are some class ones which just outshine this thing. Like Fire Elemental is ridiculous. Like that thing needs a nerf, but I'll go over that some other time. But Argent Commander, I feel like I don't want this thing redesigned. I feel like it's in a sweet spot right now where it's a bit too powerful. A little bit. It's not like Sen'jin. It hasn't been pushed into the realm of absolutely broken yet. But it is extremely good. Fortunately, this kind of card can't really be abused like Sen'jin. Or Azure Drake, for example. It can't really be abused. Like, it costs too much mana, you can't just put it down, put a huge amount of buffs on it, and then smash them in the face, and that's like turn 10. But with Sen'jin, it comes down to turn 4, and then you play like a Blessing on it, a Divine Shield, you just can't kill it. But with Argent Commander, it's a case where it's a good card. It's kind of where like True Silver Champion is. True Silver Champion is widely considered to be one of the best equipments in the game, if not the best. But True Silver, if you actually look at the card, there's not much you can change. It's powerful, it's extremely powerful, but it's not overpowered. It's not quite overpowered. It's extremely powerful. Not quite overpowered. Same with Argent Commander. It's not overpowered enough to nerf it, but it's extremely powerful to the point when this card demands respect right now, and it has done for about 2.5 months now. It's been played a lot. Knife Juggler, making a comeback, I see. It's attack against tokens, ironically, because it's a token card. One of the best 2-drops in the game. 3/2 for 2, it's a Raptor, Bloodfin Raptor, it's a 3/2 for 2. With one of the craziest abilities in the entire game. Every time you summon something, it does a damage. That's insane. It's one of the strongest effects in the whole game, and it's on a 2-drop. Like, that is why this thing is so powerful. If it costs 3 mana, it would still be good. If it costs 4 mana, it wouldn't be as good because you can't combo it off on the first turn. But it's the kind of thing where if they made a 4 mana equivalent to this thing that was like a 5/4, that thing would be extremely good. But Knife Juggler would still be the king. Why? Because you go Knife Juggler, and then you go Token Generator, Token Generator, Token Generator. Hey presto, 6 triggers in 1 turn. Like, that's a thing. That is a thing, and that is one of the reasons why Knife Juggler is respected so much. I don't think it's overpowered. They already nerfed it. Like, we don't need to nerf Knife Juggler again. It used to be a 2/3, and that was so powerful that it was actually being played in control decks. Yes, it sounds ridiculous, but it actually was. Like, Knife Juggler, the original Knife Juggler was the most broken card I have seen in a while. Like, the original Knife Juggler was literally blowing all the other 2-drops out of the water, and it's just stat, and it's amazing what a stat flip does. It's kind of what happened to Cult Master. Went from being extremely good at 3/4 to really bad. So yeah, that's a thing. But anyway, Knife Juggler is a 2-drop that will always be respected. I don't think there's as much of a place in the metagame for it right now, but obviously you can still play it, and people do play it, but it's played more as a tech against tokens than an actual sort of engine like it used to be. So, the state of the metagame, mid-range dominated for a 6th tournament in a row. Okay, we need to do something to mid-range, like the headlights are going, like we have a little ambulance right now trying to piece together the metagame because mid-range is literally wrecking it. We had so many mid-range decks this week. We had so many mid-range decks last week. Like, the only deck that really competes, I mean, the Warlock aggro deck is very inconsistent, but can if it gets a good draw. Spell Power Rogue, if it's aggro, can, but you need to go second a lot of the time. But mid-range, it's just, the mid-range minions are so powerful that there's not much you can do to mid-range right now apart from tweak the neutral minions. Like, you have to lower the power level on these, like, 4 to 6 drops because they're so high. The power level on the 4 to 6 drops is incredibly high, and it's rather ridiculous right now. There's a lot of spell power. There's a lot of spell power. But the spell power is being used in mid-range decks. So what do you end up with? A mid-range deck with a bunch of things on the board and a bunch of really powerful removal spells. Now, that combination is rather insane. And it's caused... I mean, aggro is making a small splash right now. They've got 2 decks with aggro, some mid-range decks, but there's a serious lack of control. Like, Warlock Control is the only control deck that even works right now. Like, Warlock Control and I guess Hunter Control. Hunter Control is a tier 2 deck, but Warlock Control is the only tier 1 deck that is control. The rest of them are mid-range, or there's like one aggro deck, but there's like mid-range. Mid-range is the strongest like archetype right now. Control is, I think it's second. Like, I think aggro is actually the weakest, but aggro has more of a sort of a splash that it can make. Like, aggro can be the weakest, but there will still be people who play it because a lot of people love playing aggro. There are less people who love playing control, so unless it's a Warlock control deck, you really just don't see it, because the control decks, apart from Hunter Control, which we have seen every so often, and Warlock Control, there really aren't any that can even compete. Like, the Rogue decks don't play control anymore. They kill you on turn 7. Like, that's not a control deck. That's like aggression. So, mostly minion based with a few spell power decks and minions. Basically, apart from the Rogue decks, and even the Rogue decks are becoming more minion based, spells are not quite as powerful as they used to be. You can't just do solid spell decks. Not anymore. A lot of spells got nerfed. There's not much you can do with just pure spells anymore. And all the decks are just minion based with supporting spells. The only exception, I think, would be control decks, but control decks aren't exactly good right now, so I'm not even going to use that example. And spell power rogue is about 50-50. Spells to minions, but that's only one archetype in tier 1 right now. The rest of them are all minion based. So we've got a bit of a problem in the metagame right now where mid-range is a bit too powerful. The mid-range minions are a bit too powerful, and they're just overloading control decks and aggro decks, and it's a weird thing that they need to get sorted. Like, at first, it just looked like a splash, like it was a fad and it was doing this, but in this tournament we had like 15 new people, 20 new people who weren't even playing in our previous tournaments, and it still dominated. Like, mid-range is the most powerful archetype right now out of control, aggro, mid-range, and it's just, they need to do something to it. But anyway, thank you all for watching. This has been Jotto. I do stream, so I'm going to put my information for the stream in the description. I also put the link to the last weekly. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback on what I should change or improve, add a comment in the comment section below. But as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.